Hey everyone,
Hey guys.
welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be talking about contract extensions and negotiations. We get a lot of questions about this. It's been a few years since we covered this topic, and we're at the point now in our contract where we would be, if we were planning on extending, that's what we would be talking to managers and things about now. It's kind of crazy, but we are 9 weeks into our contracts, so we'll be done before too long, and so good time to cover this topic. Whitney's going to introduce us, but as we go through this video, if you guys have any questions, or current travelers, if you have any comments or anything to say about what we say, feel free to leave those in the comments. We'll cover all the questions at the end.
All right. Hey, for those that may not be familiar with us, my name is Whitney.
And I'm Jared.
And we're both traveling doctors of physical therapy. We've been travel PTs for 9 years now, so almost a decade. We started right away when we were new grad physical therapists right out of DPT school, and we've always been travelers since then. We don't travel full time anymore. We work a couple, like one contract a year or so. We take a lot of time off. Now we are semi-retired, so we take a lot of time off to travel the world and also go back home for periods of time, sometimes working PR in between. So we've done a lot of these videos over the years. We've been doing live videos on Facebook for like 5 or 6 years now. And then more recently, we upload our videos to our podcast and our YouTube channel. Tonight, we're actually going live on both Facebook and Instagram. So hey to everyone on both platforms tonight. And then shout out to those of you that will listen later on the podcast or on YouTube.
Yeah, so if we're not looking at the camera on Instagram, that's why.
So yeah, as Jared mentioned, as we go through tonight's topic, feel free to leave a comment if you're watching live, and we'll answer any questions that you have. We'd also just love to hear from you in the comments. Are you a current traveler? Are you someone who's thinking about traveling? We'd love to hear from you. As Jared mentioned, we have talked about this topic in the past, but it's been a little bit, so we wanted to go over kind of what it would look like if you were planning on extending a contract. It is possible to extend a contract. As Jared mentioned, we're not going to be extending our current contracts. In case you missed our recent announcement, I'm pregnant and we are going to be going home for a while after this contract to have a baby. So we're not planning on extending our contracts beyond the 13 weeks, but we did want to talk to you about what that would look like if you wanted to.
Yeah, so the first thing to talk about when talking about extensions in general, we often get questions about when should you start bringing this topic up with recruiters or with managers, and should you bring it up with a manager or recruiter or both? Somewhere around halfway through the contract is usually what we did. And in terms of extensions, we extended a lot of our contracts, and we preferred, and we tell other people too, if you can't extend, if it's a contract that you like, it makes a lot of sense to extend, because moving every 3 months can be difficult. And it also saves you money, because not only is it difficult to move, if you stay in the same place for 6 months instead of just 3 months, you don't have any missed time off changing contracts. And that can save you a lot over the course of a year. Say you take 3-month contract, a week off, 3-month contract, a week off, 3-month contract, a week off, or you take 2 6-month contracts with only 1 week in between. That's a lot of extra money during the year.
Yeah, and it really just depends on your priorities as a traveler. There are some travelers out there that only plan to travel for a year or two, and after they've been somewhere for about 3 months, they're ready to move on to the next place because they want to see as many places as possible. As Jared mentioned, a big priority of ours, especially in our early years of traveling, was saving as much money as possible, which is the way that we were able to reach financial independence so early in our careers. And save so aggressively in the first 3 years of being travel therapists. So that was one of the reasons that we extended so often. It actually ended up keeping us kind of on the East Coast. We had planned to travel further, and we kind of just kept having good opportunities to extend, and we stayed relatively close to home in Virginia and North Carolina for a lot of our contracts for that reason, but it all worked out well for us and it met our priorities. So again, just kind of depends on your priorities, why you might extend. And that was the next thing we want to talk about, is what are some reasons that you might think about extending a contract?
Yeah, so somewhere in the middle of your contract, that's when you want to feel out the situation. I mean, a lot of times at a travel contract, you will get a feel of whether they're going to need a traveler on past when you're there, and you also get a feel of how good of a fit of the contract is it for you. Like, do you like the facility, and how is the manager interacting with you? Do they feel like you're doing a good job and they want to keep you there? By halfway, you should have a pretty good idea of that, and that's when you can start bringing up the topic. If it feels like they're going to need another traveler, a lot of times the managers will mention it to you even before then and say, hey, if you want to stay, we could use another traveler. We're going to have to hire someone else. In some situations, we had a couple of contracts that we wanted to extend and we weren't able to because they hired full-time staff. So there are situations where you're not going to be able to, But somewhere around the middle is where you should get a good feel for that and start either looking for your next contract, start applying for state licenses, get back in touch with your recruiters, looking at that kind of situation. Or if you're going to extend, or it might be an option, that's when you would tell your recruiter that you're interested in extending and talk to the manager and make sure that's something that they want as well.
Yeah, and it kind of just depends on the staffing needs of that clinic. Maybe you've known all along that they've been having trouble filling a permanent position and they've used travelers back to back, and maybe the conversation has already come up that if you'd like to stay longer, they'd love to have you. Or maybe you've heard through the grapevine that they've been interviewing people and they've already hired a replacement. Or maybe you knew all along it was a set amount of time they were going to need somebody. If it was like a maternity leave or something, well, it's not the same reason for staffing as just not having somebody. So kind of depends there. Some reasons that you might want to extend, as Jared mentioned, if you're really enjoying the contract. There's some people that are like, oh my gosh, I'm just really not done with this area yet. Like, I've loved it so much here. 3 months flew by and I would like to stay here longer so I can explore the area more. I've made some good friendships. Maybe you met somebody, maybe you were single and you met somebody, or maybe you're just loving your caseload and you finally feel like you got into a good groove with the facility. And now you're like, wow, this is a good fit for me. Like, I could stay here a little longer and keep making good money. And not have to jump into another contract, because sometimes, when you change contracts, there's a little uncertainty. You don't know what the next contract is going to bring. And so if it's a good situation and you don't mind staying a little longer and you're making good money, sometimes it just makes sense just to keep it going. But again, all kind of goes back to your priorities and your wants and your needs, as well as the staffing needs of the facility.
I think that uncertainty is something that new travelers, for some of you guys that are considering traveling or you just started, you might not realize how big of a deal that can be, because there are bad contracts out there, right? So we probably had 1 or 2 bad contracts out of all that we took. So most contracts are great. Most contracts are not going to be bad, but you always take the risk of, when you're going to a new contract, it not being as good as the last one you left. So if you're in a situation where it's like a great caseload, you're making good money, it's an area that you enjoy, why would you not extend, unless your goal of traveling is to move as often as possible and see as much of the country, which, again, some people do that, but for us, that wasn't a priority. And I think for a lot of people, making as much, saving as much, that is their priority.
Yeah. So, as far as how to bring up the topic, it's really going to depend on the situation. Again, maybe you've already kind of, like, the manager has brought it up to you, but if no one has brought it up at all, and you're kind of like, I don't even know how to, bring this up, right? If there's been no discussion with the manager, typically what we will do is, if the manager is on site and it is someone that we talk to on a regular basis, we'll say, hey, it's about halfway through our contract. This is usually the time where we start trying to decide what we're going to do next. So I need to start looking for my next contract. I did want to just find out, before I do start looking for new contracts, if there's a chance that you might need me here longer. And that's a good way to just bring it up and kind of breach the conversation, if you have a manager that's on site or someone that you communicate with regularly. If that's not the case, if the manager isn't on site, sometimes it makes sense just to have the recruiter do it on their end and just tell your recruiter you're thinking about extending, and then they can kind of go through the middleman, whoever that is, to ask for you. But typically, if it's somebody you talk to on a regular basis, we just kind of bring it up with the manager.
Yeah, that would be the ideal, is just have a good relationship with the manager, talk to them. If you can feel out that they want you to be there, that they haven't hired anybody, that they're going to need another traveler, say, hey, I would like to stay if you would like to have me. And then you just make that agreement between you and the manager. And then you tell your recruiter, hey, I'm going to extend. That's the best situation. But yeah, there are situations where maybe the manager's not on site, or maybe it's a regional that you don't see, where it's a good idea to go through your recruiter and have it started on that back end.
Yeah. And as far as the logistics go, you're typically just going to kind of, if you're talking to the manager, you're just sort of talking to them about whether they might need you longer. As far as actually negotiating what's going to happen from there, you typically go back to your recruiter to do that part. However, one topic you may want to discuss with the manager, is how much longer they might need you. Say you're wanting to stay for a whole additional 3 months. Say, would you need me for a full 3 months additional? What would that look like? Or say you only want to extend for a short period of time. We have done short extensions before for various reasons. One time we had a vacation that we ended up planning, and we were going to have kind of a 2-week gap where we wanted to still work right up until the vacation. So we asked if we could just extend for 2 weeks and if that would work for them. And we were able to work that out. So you might have a situation where you don't want to stay the full time, or maybe a situation where the manager says, we could probably use you for another month, but not another whole 3 months. So that is something you want to talk to the manager about if you're going that route of how long. And then once you guys kind of decide on that, then for the next part of negotiating the contract extension, this is when you go back and talk to your recruiter.
The important thing to remember about any travel contract negotiation is that everything is negotiable. I mean, length of contract, pay rates, reimbursements, when, like your schedule, you could like extend and say, hey, I want to do 410s if that's feasible. Everything is negotiable as long as it works for you and it works for the clinic. And in terms of negotiations, all of that comes down to how much they really need you and how much you really want to stay. Because if you have other options, but you know they really need you, well, then you can make demands. And if they don't meet those demands, or not demands, but you can try to push for more. And if they don't meet those, then you can go somewhere else. Whereas if you really want to stay, or they just kind of need you, then if you push for a lot more, they're going to be like, okay, never mind, forget it. So you have to feel that situation out too, because if it's a place that was looking for a traveler for 3 months before you started there, and you know that they don't have that many travelers, then you could say things like, hey, I'll stay, but I really want to make more money, or want a better schedule, or any possible permutation of contract changes you want, you can negotiate.
Yeah, so really that's what it comes down to when it comes to any kind of negotiating, is knowing who has the upper hand in the situation. If you're kind of like, I don't really want to stay, but like it would be all right, and they're like begging you to stay, this is a really good opportunity to capitalize on something that you want to get out of it. Whether that be more money, some time off worked into the contract to go home or go on vacation, or changing your schedule, or whatever it might be. If they're begging you to stay and you know that they're desperate. But if it's a situation where like you don't have any other job options that are looking good, you really want to stay because you met somebody, and it's going to be really bad for you if you don't stay and you have to go somewhere else. Just be a little bit more lenient when it comes to your negotiations. It doesn't mean you have to like accept less money or anything like that. Just know, like, don't push them too hard, because if you push them too hard and they have other options, they might say, never mind, just forget.
Exactly, and that applies to every negotiation, whether it's a permanent job, a travel job. If you have a lot of options and the facility doesn't, then you can push for more. If you have few options and the facility has a lot of options, they have other travelers that would take your position easily, then you can't push for as much. And that's why any one-size-fits-all advice about negotiating pay or negotiating anything to do with permanent jobs or travel jobs doesn't really apply, because every situation is different.
We got a couple comments coming in. Thanks for those of you guys that are tuning in live. If you are watching live, please feel free to leave a comment or a question either on Instagram or on Facebook. We'd also really appreciate if you would just hit the thumbs up button or the heart button if you are enjoying the video and learning things. We appreciate that. So Allie, who's an experienced traveler, says, I have done a lot of maternity leave contracts, and those types of contracts don't give you the option to extend for obvious reasons. That makes sense. And she said she also had some other contracts where they asked her to extend, but they dropped the pay rate. Now, this is definitely not typical, especially if they're the ones asking you to extend. Typically, the pay should stay the same, or hopefully you have an opportunity to ask for more. But Allie said, obviously, in the situation, if they were going to drop the pay, she wasn't going to extend, and she did not extend.
And Tyler on Instagram had the same question. Have you guys encountered times when they want to drop the pay rate for an extension, basically?
He said, it happened to me with some travel contracts once they extended for a while. And it really just depends. We did see this a lot during COVID, or like the year or so after COVID, when pay rates were really high. And so sometimes they were offering really high pay rates initially, and then they kind of had to go back and drop their rates to what was more normal. That was pretty much the only time we were really hearing it. We also had one situation a long time ago, back in 2017, where when they hired us, they were super desperate because they suddenly had, I think it was like 5 or 10 employees quit all at once who left the hospital to go start their own clinic. And so they were extremely desperate when they hired us, and they hired us at a really high rate. And then we asked to extend, and they said, we can extend you, but we can't extend you at this rate. And in that situation, I think we did drop the pay rate just slightly, because again, it still worked out well for us. It was still a good payment, a good pay for us.
Yeah, and that is definitely possible. So if you want to extend, like we were saying, the contract is negotiable on both sides. And if it's a situation where either they were paying a really high rate, maybe it was a crisis situation, maybe they really needed you at first, and now maybe they realize either they can't afford to keep you at that rate, or they have other applicants that will take a lower rate, then you just have to decide, like, do I want to stay for a lower rate? In some cases, this was happening a ton for nurses. And I was in some of the nursing groups reading about these kind of situations. And basically, you either have to decide, is it worth it to stay at this reduced rate? In some cases, it really is. Because say your initial rate was $3,000 a week, and it was a ton of money. And then they want to reduce it down to $2,500 a week. And it's like, okay, this isn't great, but it's still a really good pay rate, and it's more than I'd make in another contract. In that case, great, still take the extension. But if it's a situation where you're already making, say on the lower end, say we're making $1,900 or $1,800, and they want to drop it down to $1,600, but you know you can go find another contract that's paying $2,000 or $2,200, well then yeah, definitely don't stay unless there's a reason that you really need to stay.
Yeah, it sounds like that's the situation Allie was in. She said it was a really low rate to start with. I really can't understand how or why they would do that, other than they were just trying to take advantage of you. And definitely in that situation, say, no, I'm leaving. Like,
Either
I'm not
that,
gonna.
or they knew that they could maybe get like a new grad in there and pay them less. And
It's possible too. Yeah. So, but I would say that's definitely more rare. In most circumstances, the pay is going to stay exactly the same, or in a lot of cases, you can get even higher pay. And we're going to talk about now why you may be able to get higher pay and how you can go about negotiating that.
And that was one of the questions too. How much do you feel like is okay to ask for when trying to negotiate an extension? Tyler said, I noticed they dropped the pay when we started with a very high rate. Yeah, I think usually that's going to be the case. Very rarely is it going to be already a low rate and then they try to drop the rate even more, just because either they keep you at that. I mean, either they drop the rate and you leave and then they try to find someone else that won't take the job for that pay rate, or they offer you a reasonable wage, you stay, and then they don't have to find someone and hire someone new, which usually when the facility starts thinking about that, they're like, oh, we'd rather keep someone that's already trained, that's doing a good job, versus roll the dice on a new traveler that we have to train and maybe won't do a good job.
And that's a good point. When you do start talking about why you want more money or why they need to definitely not drop the rate, at least keep it the same, you want to explain to them, I'm already here, I'm already trained, you're not going to have to train somebody, you're not going to have to find somebody new. Hopefully you shouldn't have to explain that, but if it comes down to negotiations, you might just explain why it's in their best interest to keep you and not have to wait and see when they could hire another traveler, potentially have a drop in the caseload, a gap there, have to retrain somebody else from scratch. So, there's definitely a lot of reasons why they should pay you the same or more.
So in terms of negotiating an increase in pay, so like we said, everything depends on the situation, because as you can see, there are situations where they might actually offer you a lower rate, or they might say, no, we're not going to increase at all. In most cases, though, you will get a small increase in your rate. And the reason that you get a small increase, it's not so much that your pay rate is increasing, it's a reallocation of the initial funds. And what I mean by that is, on your first contract, when you go to an area, you usually get reimbursement for things like mileage to the area, or licensing, background check, drug test. They have to pay all these costs for you up front for you to start that contract. When you extend a contract, now those costs aren't there, right? So those were already allocated in that initial pay package you got. When you're extending, you can usually expect to get those costs added back into your weekly pay. How much that is will really depend. I mean, if you got a lot for mileage reimbursement up front, and it was a California job where you got a $700 reimbursement for license and all of your expenses there, and they had a bunch of onboarding costs, it could be $2,000 that they had to spend on you or on your behalf up front that you should expect to get back in the extension. On the other hand, it could be a situation where the license was really cheap to get. Maybe it was a compact license, so there was no reimbursement. Maybe it was only 2 hours away, so there wasn't really any mileage reimbursement. And maybe you only had to get a background check and a drug test, and it really didn't cost that much. In that case, the amount they're adding back in is not going to be as much. So it really depends. On average, it's usually going to be somewhere in the $1 to $2 an hour range, which means over the course of an extension, if you're staying for 13 weeks, you could expect to either get a dollar or two added to your taxable pay or your stipends, or have that added as a bonus or some sort of reimbursement, and that would be in the range of $500 to $1,000. That's the most common.
And keep in mind, as we mentioned, this part is all with your recruiter. You typically don't really talk about the pay directly with the manager or the facility. This is all something that's negotiated with the recruiter and the staffing company. Now, especially when it comes to this part of what we're talking about with why you should get a little bit more money, or get the same amount of money back that you got in the beginning of the contract. That's all coming from the staffing company. Those were costs that were incurred by the staffing company on your behalf back in the beginning of the contract. So if all things were the same, with the bill rate. So it's really important here, if you're new to travel therapy, to understand what we're talking about here when we talk about the bill rate. The bill rate is the amount of money that the facility pays the travel company
For each hour you work.
Yep, for each hour you work. And then from that amount of money, the travel company has to cover all the expenses and the costs of having you as an employee, take their overhead out, their operating costs, and then pay you from there. If you're not familiar with bill rates, we're not going to go into too much detail about how that works, but we have a lot of articles and videos talking about bill rates and understanding that. So all this money that we're talking about being reallocated back into your extension is coming from those upfront costs that your travel company took out of the bill rate to cover your license and your onboarding costs and things like that. So if the recruiter tries to say to you, well, I can't give you more money for the extension because the facility didn't increase the bill rate, they're still paying us the same, you should say, no, I'm not asking you to do an increase in bill rate, which is something we're going to talk about separately. It's just that, in the beginning of my contract, I had a reimbursement for this, this, and this. And so that should be added back in equal to this contract. And so it might be that they reimbursed you an equal amount. Say you had $500 in licensure costs. Well, they don't need to reimburse you for a license exactly, but if there's some other thing that you could get reimbursed for that's equivalent to that, like a CEU course, or maybe you need to buy new scrubs or something else, get creative and talk to your recruiter about what else could you reimburse me for the equivalent of that license, because that money should still be there. Or if there's nothing they can reimburse you for that really makes sense, then they can, instead of just giving you $500 for a reimbursement, they can work it into your hourly rate. Or if your stipend is not already maxed out, they could work it back into your stipend. So just kind of, you want to go into this conversation prepared to say, okay, in the beginning, you paid this and this and this. That should be worked back into my contract extension in some form. Also, I know that you had a lot of onboarding costs to get my credentialing done, to get my background check and my drug screen and all those things. Those costs should be worked back in because now your company is not having to cover those costs for me on the extension. So find out, some way they can work that back in, whether it be a reimbursement on your hourly or on your stipends.
Reimbursement would be ideal because then it's not taxed and it's easy to just be like, I want to go back home, and if you just cover mileage there and back and it costs $700 or whatever it is, then that makes sense. Or reimbursement, like Whitney said, for clothing or cell phone or some kind of thing like that, it makes the most sense because then you don't have to pay taxes on that. But if there's no option for that, or if the company doesn't do it that way, every company does things differently, which you'll really find out in travel if you work with a bunch of different companies. If that's the case, then you can just add that. A lot of them will do it as a bonus, like just a flat bonus that's taxable, maybe a $750 bonus that they give you. And that's reasonable as well. It just depends on how the company does things and how you want it done.
Okay, so all of that is assuming that the pay rate from the facility stays the same. The facility is saying, I'm going to pay you the same amount that I paid you before in terms of the bill rate, but the travel company has some money they can work back into your contract equal to what they gave you back in the beginning, or equal to the costs that they covered on your behalf in the beginning. Now, there might also, in addition to that, be an opportunity to get an increase in the bill rate. Now, why would they increase the bill rate? This goes back to, the supply and demand. How desperate are they? If they're really pushing you to extend, they're desperate, but you could kind of take it or leave it. You could go back to your recruiter and say, hey, I know they really want me to extend. I know they're really desperate. I will consider extending, but only if they'll increase the bill rate.
Yeah. And so like we said, if they're not willing to increase the bill rate, which it depends on the situation, it depends also on how much bureaucracy there is on the other end. If you're negotiating with the hospital system, they might have a flat rate and they will not change it, in which case you're not going to get a bill rate increase. Whereas maybe if you're negotiating with a single clinic, outpatient clinic with just one single manager, maybe they could be like, okay, we don't really want to pay $5 an hour more, but we don't also want to hire a new traveler and have to train them, so we're willing to do it. And yes, you really have to fill out that situation. Is it an area that people really want to go to, where they're going to be able to fill your position easily, or is it an area where people don't really want to go to and they're not going to be able to fill it easily, in which case it's a lot easier to ask for a bill rate increase. In terms of how much you can get if they are willing to increase the bill rate, the sky's kind of the limit there. If basically in terms of how much they're able to offer you. So if it's an outpatient clinic and they have a lot of negotiating room, and maybe their margins are pretty good, which is rare for outpatient clinics these days, but maybe they're doing really well and they're able to pay $10 an hour more on your bill rate, then you would get a significant increase in pay. That might be $300 or $400 a week more. Whereas if they're not willing to increase at all, that's when you would probably get $1 or $2 an hour more. So it really, really depends.
Yeah, and hopefully in this situation, hopefully you have a great recruiter and they can help you to navigate the situation. So if you have the insider knowledge of knowing, okay, the manager, they're really desperate. I know they need me here. I know they don't have any other candidates. And maybe your recruiter's also looking at their end and they're like, I know we haven't submitted any candidates for this job, and I've seen this job come up time and time again, and I know that they're desperate. And so you guys put your heads together, and then maybe the recruiter can help you with understanding what position you're in to negotiate. And then they might have a better experience with knowing what's reasonable to ask and what they're likely to get. So we have a lot of great recruiters that we've worked with that have helped us with the situation. They're like, oh yeah, I know we could definitely ask for like, $3 more per hour, no problem. If you really want more, and then they could run the pay package for you and tell you, because that doesn't mean a whole lot. Like just knowing, $3 an hour more on the bill rate, you may not be able to completely just work out how much more is that going to be for me per week. But your recruiter should know. They could say, okay, if we get $3 an hour more, that would take your weekly pay up to this. And then you'd say, maybe that's worth it, maybe it's not. Or maybe you kind of have a ballpark figure where you're like, well, I at least want to be making $2,200 per week after taxes on the extension. Do you think that's realistic? And so they can kind of go back and forth with you, and then maybe they say, you know what, why not, let's just push it a little bit. Let's ask for a $6 an hour increase, and we'll just see what they say.
Yeah, and these bill rate increases are not that common. So if you're going into an extension, you should expect that you're probably not going to get a bill rate increase on the extension. I would say probably less than 20% of the time these facilities are willing to do that. And it's only if they are in a situation where they really want you to stay and they're very desperate. So like Whitney said, if it's a situation where you have multiple options and you can kind of take it or leave it, and you know they really need you, that's the situation where then you can really negotiate. Because if you push for $5 an hour more on the bill rate and they won't do it, then just go take a different job and you have other options. But if they will, then great, you stay. And that's where you're negotiating from a position of strength. Whereas if you really need to stay and they don't really need you, then chances of them increasing the bill rate, not very high at all.
But even if you do really want to stay, it doesn't hurt to ask. You could always say like, hey, do you think there's a chance they'll increase the bill rate? And you could maybe try and just...
With the recruiter.
Yeah, with the recruiter. Talk to the recruiter and say like, I don't know, let's just ask. And then if they say no, and then it ends up being that your pay is about the same, then you can be like, oh well, at least we asked. I'll probably still take the extension. But it really depends on you. It depends on the facility, how much you can negotiate there. But at minimum, you should definitely be able to get some of those reimbursements and upfront costs back in your extension, equal to what you received back at the beginning.
Yep. Okay, so then if you do want to extend, say they're not willing to increase the bill rate, it's a situation where they can kind of take it or leave it in terms of you extending, and you can also take it or leave it. You decide to stay. Maybe you get a reimbursement of $750 up front as your pay increase. Then you have to look at other things with the contract. So like we talked about, an extension in terms of length of time is negotiable. So you and the manager need to talk and try to figure out, how long do you think that you'll need me? In some cases, you might think, okay, I've been here 8 weeks. I really like this place. I'll stay as long as they'll let me. Maybe you extend 6 months at that point, and that gives you obviously a lot more leverage. Whereas maybe you have a trip planned in 6 weeks and you say, I can only extend 6 weeks. Well, then you don't have as much leverage because it's a lot less, commitment to the facility, right? A 6 month stay, they know they're going to have someone there for a while, whereas 6 weeks, they're going to not be as willing to negotiate. But in terms of time off, like say you want to extend for a full contract, but you have a wedding that you need to go to. That's when you would negotiate that. I need these days off if you allow me to extend, or if I extend, I need these days off. Or maybe you say something like, I want to extend, but I want to work 4/10s, or I want to work a different schedule of whatever works for your facility.
Yeah.
So those types of things, then you need to talk to them about and try to figure out what works for both of you.
The time off thing is really important. We know a lot of travelers that use this to their advantage. For example, we have some friends that are on contract not that far away from us here in Virginia, and they are in a really good situation. They're in a one-on-one outpatient contract. They're a PT couple, so the two of them are working one-on-one outpatient, and they're making really good pay, especially for rural Virginia. It's like well over $2,000 a week. I want to say it's like $2,300 or something like that. So they really like it there. It's working really well for them financially. They have a lot of their goals with travel therapy are similar to ours, where they would prefer to stay in the same place for longer as long as they're making good money. So they've actually extended a few times up until the point where they're going to be there almost a year. But they still wanted to have opportunities to travel and go do some things throughout that year that they're going to stay there. So they've extended a couple times, and they've worked off just like 2-week or 3-week breaks in between. So they'll say, yes, we'll stay longer, but we need 3 weeks off between this part of the contract and this part of the contract, so they can go do a road trip or do something for fun and then come back to their good, stable jobs that they like, that they're making good money at. So negotiating time off can be a really good strategy too, just depending on your wants and your needs. As Jared mentioned, maybe they'll be willing if you wanted to like try to negotiate changing your schedule, but that really depends on the facility. Maybe you might also want to look at renegotiating something else that was on your contract that you didn't realize before. Maybe you didn't have guaranteed hours, or maybe they were only guaranteeing like 32 hours, but you want to try to push to see if they'll guarantee 40 or something like that. So again, there's lots of things at this point in the contract where you're signing a whole new contract. So if there's anything you want to ask for, talk to the recruiter about it at this juncture. Now, again, it just depends on if they'll say yes or no, but this is when you want to talk to them about it.
Yeah. One other thing to think about before you even go into the extension conversation is, do you like your housing situation? Are you going to be able to stay there longer? Or is there going to be something else in the area? Because you don't want to agree to an extension and then find out that you can't stay at the place you're going to stay longer than the 3 months you signed up for. So that's something to really consider before you ever get into these types of conversations. Make sure there's not something that is keeping you from being able to extend before you agree to an extension, obviously.
Yeah, definitely have to think about your housing situation for sure. And in some cases, like some people end up moving for their extension. If that's worth it to you to still extend and you do have other housing options, great, but definitely like keep that in mind before you commit to it.
Yep. All right.
So I think that's most of what we want to talk about. We definitely want to take some questions from those of you guys that are watching live. So whether you're on Facebook or Instagram, feel free to type a question in the comments section and we will answer it for you.
Would landlords on sites like Furnish Finder be willing to negotiate? And congrats on the baby. Thank you. I saw Cody also said congrats on the baby. Thank you guys. Would landlords on site be able to so Furnish Finder is just like Airbnb. I mean, they're just individuals on the site and everything's negotiable. So if you contact them and they don't have a lot of people looking for housing, then yeah, they're going to be willing to negotiate. We've had situations where we negotiated a slightly lower rate. On Furnish Finder, a lot of times you can just get their phone number and message them directly and just bring that up right away. So if it's a place, say you have a few different options and one of them you really like, but it's $200 or $300 a month more, then you could always say, hey, I would like to take it, but I found this other place. Is there any way that you could do $1,200 a month or whatever it is? And even on this contract, when we came and looked at places here, all three of the places that we looked at, they were willing to reduce the price a little bit, just depending on if we were, because we had other options. We told them like, we're going to look at these other places, and all of them were like, okay, well, let me know, and I might be able to work on the rate a little bit. So a lot of times they are negotiable there. It just depends on how much they need someone and how much interest they have in the space.
However, if it's super competitive, you may not have any options. We tried to negotiate a little bit when we were looking for housing in Anchorage, Alaska, the summer that we were there, and housing was so competitive there. They were like, we have 14 people ready to take this.
Yeah.
So
in
if
some
anything,
cases,
they were going to raise the
yes.
rate.
In some cases, and the same was the case for Hawaii, we looked at all the options and there was only one that was even remotely affordable. And if they had said, hey, we've got a lot of interest, we would have said, oh, we'll pay you $200 more just because we really wanted it. So it's negotiable both ways. If they're getting a lot of interest and you want to get their attention, maybe you offer more. If they're not getting a lot of interest and, then maybe you can negotiate a discount.
And the same kind of goes here for this situation with an extension. If you're going to be staying longer and you know that they would like for you to stay longer, they would prefer to have the same tenant and just carry you over without having to have somebody new move in. There's a chance you could even try to negotiate down the rent. Like if you're saying, hey, I'm going to commit to another 6 months here if you need me, if you still need a tenant, but could we lower the rate a little bit, the rental, if I'm going to stay 6 more months? And they might be willing to do that because it's less hassle for them. They don't have to clean and paint or whatever they have to do to turn over for a new tenant. So there are situations there where that could work in your favor too.
Yeah, and you always have to remember with any of these things, whether it's extending your contract, extending your stay somewhere, the devil that you do know is better than the devil that you don't know. Like in a situation where things might not be perfect for a landlord or for a tenant or for a clinic or whatever, a lot of times they would rather keep you or you would rather stay there than go somewhere else where you have uncertainty and you have to deal with the hassle of moving or changing clinics and all of that. So just keep that in mind. Like if you've already been somewhere for a while they're going to want you usually to stay versus trying to find someone else, clean the place, all that stuff. So you might be able to, if you extend your stay at a place, you might be able to negotiate a lower rate, just because for them, if you pay $100 a month less, that's a lot less hassle than them having to clean the place and find someone else and hope they're as good of a tenant as you.
All right, so we've got a couple more questions coming in on Instagram. Not necessarily related to this topic, but just sort of some random questions. What are the weekly pay rates that you're seeing for a PTA traveler?
It really depends. I think the range right now, probably anywhere from, it could be $1,000 a week up to, we've seen like $1,800 a week. And probably the average, I would say, is somewhere between $1,200 and $1,500 a week right now, probably 12 to 14. That's mostly what we're seeing.
After taxes.
After taxes in terms of like advertised pay rates. But yeah, the range is pretty big, as low as $1,000 for some jobs, like say it's a skilled nursing that doesn't get very high reimbursement rates. They might be offering really low rates. And then there's some jobs, home health California jobs, that might offer $1,800 a week or maybe even more than that. So the average though is probably in the $1,200 to $1,400 range.
Alrighty, any more questions on Facebook or Instagram? Did you see any more on Instagram?
No, I don't think so.
Alrighty, well, we'll wrap up for tonight's topic. If you guys have any questions after the video, you can feel free to comment on the video itself or send us a message directly. I think we have a follow-up.
Cody is a PTA, travel PTA that's been traveling for a while now, and he said $1,200 to $1,600 a week after taxes, unless Reliant, and some places in southern Texas, $900 to $1,100 a week. So yeah, it depends.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, so reach out to us if you guys have any questions. Feel free to send us a message on Facebook or Instagram or shoot us an email. Happy to answer any more questions that you have. But hopefully this was really helpful to you guys in understanding the way that contract extensions work and how to handle those negotiations. But again, we're always happy to answer any questions via private message as well.
Yep. For upcoming videos, we realized that it's been several years now since we touched on a lot of these sort of basic type videos. So we'll probably go back and start going through some of the more basic things, because 3 years is a lifetime in travel therapy. Most people now that are traveling weren't traveling 3 years ago, and a lot of people that were traveling 3 years ago have now stopped. So we'll probably go back and start doing some of those. But if you guys have any recommendations or suggestions or videos you want to see us talk about, please let us know, send us a message, and yeah, we'll probably cover those in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I thought we had talked about contract negotiations somewhat recently, and then I went and looked back, and it was 2021 was the last time we did a video on contract extension negotiations. And I'm like, okay, 3 years, I think it's about time to talk about this again. So
Yep.
We'll probably go back and do some more just about like contracts in general and like all that kind of stuff.
One last question. What is considered full-time in home health travel? In terms of hours or units, or a lot of times home health goes by points, and it depends on if you're an evaluating therapist or an assistant.
It's a minimum number of visits.
It depends on the contract. I would say the average for an evaluating therapist is probably 4 to 5 visits a day, maybe 4 to 6. If you're doing a lot of treatments on the higher end, if you're doing a lot of eval, starter care, it's usually on the lower end. And usually it's a point-based system. So starter cares will be more points. They want you a certain number of points per week, like 25. And a treatment might be 1 point, reevaluation might be 1.5, eval 2, starter care 2.5, something like that. That's the most common thing you see for home health, but every contract's different. Some of them just do number of visits, some of them do a point system, so it depends on the contract.
Yeah, every home health agency is going to be a little bit different. So these are the questions you would ask during your interview with the home health company. Some of them might just do like a total number of points or visits per week, so it may not be per day. We know that a lot of travel therapists use this to their advantage, where they'll front load some of their week to where they have like no visits on Fridays or like less visits on Fridays, if it's just a weekly quota they need to meet, but really just depends. Probably also going to depend on an evaluating therapist versus an assistant, because the evaluating therapist, you're going to have to take into account those starter cares sometimes, which is usually for PT only, or evaluations, discharge, those kind of things. But yeah, just depends.
And if you are an evaluating therapist and you're negotiating a home health contract and it's something where they tell you they want 5 visits per day, be very careful with that, because you don't know if it could be 5 evaluations, which is almost impossible to do, 5 starter cares, which is impossible to do in a day, or it could be 5 treatments, which is really easy. So most of the time it's going to be a point system, but if not, you really need to clarify, like, okay, well, what am I going to be seeing? I can't do 5 evaluations in a day for home health, that kind of thing.
Yep.
All right, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you guys. If you have any questions or comments, leave them. We'll always come back and look at the questions and comments after we finish the video as well. So anybody watching on the replay, feel free to leave questions and comments too.
All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Oh, and this weekend, hopefully we'll see some of you at MedVenture Camp. We will be there. It's June the 6th through the 9th, so we're super excited for that.
Yep. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.